Okay, for our lesson tonight, if you turn to the Book of Esther, we're going to take a whirlwind tour of that book. And one of the things that you see lots of times in life is that the great people are often overshadowed by figures who simply stand out a little bit more. Sometimes it's the people who are working behind the scenes really that save the day. And that's certainly the case in the Book of Esther. It should be called the Book of Mordecai, because Esther's uncle Mordecai is the main character in this, because he shines through so much as someone, as a child of God should, that he's giving her good advice, and he's being a good citizen of the kingdom that he lives in. There are just so many things that we look at in here, and we find him being a man of huge faith, and seeing ways not just to help himself, but ways to help his family, ways to help his beloved brethren, the children of Israel, who are in captivity at the time, and helping them that their lives would be better. So he stands behind Esther. He trained Esther. He encourages Esther. And when the time comes, he doesn't fail to put the pressure on her to do the right thing, not just for herself, but for a multitude of people. Now, just a brief history lesson. This event probably takes place down about the 480s, 470s, 460s. It's one of the last books written in the Old Testament. It's down to that period, right before the 400 years of darkness when there are no prophets. She's in that time period. Mordecai's in that time period. It's after the children of Israel have been taken captive. Now, we remember that the Assyrians took the northern kingdom over and took a lot of the people out of the northern kingdom about 720 BC. 120 years to 140 years later, Judah falls, the southern kingdom. And those people are taken into Babylonian captivity. Now, the Babylonians had defeated the Assyrians, so all those people scattered all over the Middle East are captives. And they really don't belong anywhere. Now, with the Assyrians would take them and put them in several places. The Babylonians usually put them in particular places, and that's why we find with Ezekiel, they're by the river Kibar. There's a settlement there, and there's settlements all over the place, but we understand the difference between the two. So these people have been here for a long time. And in 536 BC, right around that time period, 538 BC, the Medo-Persian Empire defeats the Babylonian Empire, and they take over everything. So we're talking about, 40, 50, 60 years after that, down to about the time where the last of the prophets speak. There's problems in the kingdom. Now, the king, Ahasuerus, has a family crisis. He's kind of like Herod in the New Testament. The Herod, not Herod the Great, though somewhat like that, but Herod, who has John beheaded. Hey, he's kind of like this one, that he says some things and he makes some vows that he shouldn't make. And he likes to kind of get up on his high horse every now and then, especially when he has his friends over to visit. And on one of these occasions, they're drinking and banqueting, and he's bragging about his wife, how beautiful Vashti is. And they're all saying, well, yeah, maybe she is. I don't know really what the conversation leads up to, but he's going to prove it to them, so he calls for Vashti to come and show everyone his beauty, or her beauty. And she refuses. She's not going to be put on display for all those drunken people, no matter how high of nobility they are. She's just not going to be put on display. So she is divorced from being queen. That's all in the first chapter. And the second chapter really begins to tell the story of selecting a new queen and how the process takes place. There's a decree that goes out to every corner of the empire to bring the loveliest young women to the capital, that a new queen could be chosen. Because a king just cannot have his queen tell him no. She's got to honor his every wish. You know, if the queen doesn't honor his wishes, and then, you know, what's going to happen with the rest of his kingdom. So in chapter 2, we're introduced to Mordecai and Esther. And Mordecai is really a man who lived a true religion. Now, he's a man in a foreign country. He's not where the temple is, because the temple has been rebuilt and some people have gone back. He's not there. He's separated, but still he's going to worship his God in spite of the situation where he's at. So in Esther chapter 2 and verse 7, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So here, you know, this guy is like a cousin, you know, but she has a need. She is an orphan, and he does the right thing. He doesn't say, oh, well, that's her tough luck. She's just going to have to get along as best as she can. He takes her into his home, raises her like she was his own daughter, cares for her, teaches her about her people, about her heritage. And of course, there they are living in a strange land, and it's very important that she learn about her heritage. So just as it's important as that our children learn about Christianity, because we live in a strange land. We live in a fallen world, and we've got to teach our children how different we are because of our heritage, the Christian heritage. Now, that doesn't mean that, like the Jews, that Christians are just, we're born Christians, you know, at our birth. No, but that also encompasses explaining to our children why they need to be saved, why they need to be born again. So he raised her as his own daughter. That's kind of like James 1:27. Pure religion, undefiled before God, is to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. So he's keeping a part of the law where you take care of your family and you make sure that others are taken care of. It was probably Mordecai that sponsored Esther. Now look at verses 8 and 9. As it was when the king's commanded decree were heard that many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him. This is Esther. Esther pleased him. He saw something different in her. And you wonder what it is that maybe would be different. Well, look at some of the stories, maybe watch some of the movies that are written about that time period and about how these things would happen. And you would see that most of the women there, they were concerned about themselves. They were concerned about their beauty. They were concerned about them becoming the queen, and they would do things and attack others. You know, it's just human nature. But here, because of her training, the discipline that she learned, she stood out. Yes, she was beautiful, but so were all those other women. But something stood out about her. She was different, and it was because of what was inside. It was because of her heart. And the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. And then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants into the best place in the house of the women. So, yeah, she's different. And he saw that, and he treated her different. He treated her kindly. But it was probably Mordecai who sponsored her. Mordecai was probably saying, hey, here's a chance. Here's a chance for us. Here's a chance for you. Here's a chance for our people to have some relief in this terrible country. All right? So he was a wise man. One of the things that he was wise about, he told her not to reveal her nationality. Esther, in verse 10 here, don't tell them that you're a Jew. Don't tell them you're from Judea. Just keep that under your hat for right now. Oh, why? Prejudicial reasons, right? Prejudicial reasons. She may have been beautiful and she may have been totally different, but if they found out that she was a Judean, she'd be out the door and nothing would happen. Okay? Well, is that wrong? Well, if you go back to the book of Proverbs, which is a book of wisdom, tells us, Ecclesiastes, which is also a book of wisdom, that there's a time to kind of be quiet. Just a time to be quiet. And then a time to reveal things. Time to kill, time to eat, all those things. All right? So, what's the timing on it? See? The wisdom that is there that this man is giving her. And in verse 20 of the same chapter, she doesn't tell him. And the king doesn't find out until after they're married, until there's a crisis that comes. And by that time, he loves her so much that it's not going to make any difference. In verse 11, he visits the court every day. He goes out and he paces in the courtyard, waiting for somebody who's empowered to come out, and so he can ask, how's she doing? How is she doing? Now, how's Esther doing? Esther would be her Medo-Persian name. The other name, if I can say it correctly, Hadassah, that would be her Jewish name. But see, she doesn't use that, and they don't use it. How's Esther doing? Is she being treated all right? Oh boy, she's being treated good. She's in her separate place, and she's got maidservants and all of this. She's found favor there. Yeah, well, that's the providence of God working, isn't it? Well, Mordecai had every reason to hate the king of the people who oppressed Israel. Certain people were allowed to go back, other people weren't. And apparently they weren't allowed to go back to Jerusalem. There always seemed to be trouble with this. And building the temple, you can read about it in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah also. So he discovered a plot to assassinate the king. Because he's out there by the gates, and he's around the people, and he's listening and keeping his ears open. And chapter 3, verse 1, after these things, King Ahasuerus, let me drop back here, 21 through 23. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. In other words, they were going to kill him. They were going to assassinate him. So when he heard about this, the thing that he does is he gets word to the king. There's trouble. Watch out, your life's in danger. So this is found out. See, it's kind of, Mordecai doesn't get credit for it here. He gets credit for it later. Who's the man in the kingdom that's done something and he didn't get any credit for it? Well, the king's up at night reading and he finds out about Mordecai. So that's coming later on in the story, isn't it? Because he didn't really seek the credit. He wanted something greater. He wanted something for his people. So the fruit of his righteous act, though not rewarded immediately, would later give the king an opportunity. to open the door to peace for his people, for Mordecai's people. And many lives of God's people would be spared. Now, because of the unsuccessful coup, the attempted assassination on the king's life, the king has to have somebody as doorkeepers. They're kind of like the guards. We might say they were Secret Service agents. That would be more to how our society would look at it, our culture would look at it. So he's got to appoint somebody else to be close, so he appoints this man by the name of Haman. Haman might have been a social climber. You know, he might have been one who played politics to get up to his position, but he wasn't a very good individual. He had some prejudices against the Judeans. And if you look at this, you'll find that he was an Agagite. Way back in 1 Samuel chapter 15 through 17, you can do some reading in there, and you find out that there was a king of the Amalekites by the name of Agag. And Saul went out to defeat him. And when Saul went out to defeat him, God said, wipe them all out, wipe out their animals, don't bring anything back. And of course, Saul brought back sheep and cattle and stuff, and here's the king. Hey, here comes Samuel, here comes the prophet. What have you done? Oh, I did what God told me to do, but I did what God told me to do, but I spared these things. And, well, that's what the people wanted. See? That's what the people wanted. The people didn't want to do what God said to do, and Saul didn't want to do what God said to do, but when it came down to it, Saul just blamed it on the people. This is what the people want. It's an Agagite. This is what happens when you don't do God's will. You're supposed to wipe them all out. They let some escape. And this continued on for several hundred years. And now you maybe begin to understand the hatred that Haman had for the children of Israel because of that family relationship, what had been done to the Amalekites. Well, he's promoted. He's given a job, and he's given a job that he can't really handle. So Haman let the glory of his office, see, he's promoted, he's somebody who cannot handle the job, but because he's got the job, it goes to his head. And the glory of the office leads him to a hatred of God's people through Mordecai. And Mordecai kind of aggravates it a little bit. Look at verses 2 through 6 of chapter 3. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. When the king's servants who were with the king, or within the king's gate, said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. So he wasn't going to bow down to anybody but to God. He would be very cordial in the presence of the king because that's what God says to do. But as for Haman, he knew and understood that Haman was an evil man. Now verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath, see? And that's where pride goes to. When pride doesn't get what it wants, it turns to anger and to wrath. So he set out to harm Mordecai. But he was going to do it by harming the whole people of Mordecai. Verse 6, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, say, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So you see how it's about Mordecai. It's about Mordecai. It's always, see, where this is going. And Esther, yes, she's out there in front, but it's Mordecai that the story really is about. So Mordecai wouldn't bow down before Haman because it's wrong to give honor to the wicked. Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 24. So Haman used his access to the king to gain a decree to put the Jews to death. Destroy the Jews. Verses 8 through 11 there, chapter 3. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws." That's right. They tried to keep the law of Moses. They tried to honor and serve the God of heaven. Now, that doesn't mean they couldn't be good citizens. In fact, you're going to see how Mordecai was a good citizen. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. In other words, there were a lot of people who hated the Jews back then and were willing to put up the money to get this work done, Haman being one of them. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you." He's put in charge of this extermination process. That's kind of like Hitler putting it in the hands of, was it Goebbels that in World War II that was set with destroying the Jews? Okay? Take care of it. Just get rid of it. I don't want anything to do with it, basically, is what's being said. But you see how all of this was perpetuated by Haman. Haman had gained a position of trust. The king trusted him, but the king didn't know it was something personal. He didn't understand that there was a personal hatred there that was driving this, that it wasn't that the Jews were people that were opposed to the king. It's just they wanted to worship and serve their God the way that their God had asked them to do. So against this great injustice, Mordecai showed himself to be a courageous man, trusting in God to protect him and the people, trusting in the providence of God. Look at chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes, because that's what you did in those days. It would show that you had some remorse, or not remorse, but concern. You were mourning over what was happening. He tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter voice. Nah, you're supposed to put on a happy face and just pretend that everything's all right. That's the way that you do it. Well, Mordecai was different, see? But you don't come around the king's place dressed like that with a sad face. You make the king angry. King has to understand what he's doing is causing sadness, causing people heartache, see? And this is the way that he's going to present his case. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. So, listen, he didn't run away. He knew what was coming. He knew what was happening, but he didn't run away because he had faith in God. So what does he do? He runs headlong into the strength of the opposition. He takes his case right to the gates of the king's house. Here I am, torn clothes, sackcloth and ashes. Ask me what I'm doing here. Ask me about it, and I'll tell you what's going on. See? Courageous man, willing to stand up. It was the words of Mordecai that spurred Esther to trust in the providence of God and approach the king about this grievous matter. Look at verses 13 through 17. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place." See, he trusted in the providence of God. It may not happen in what he's saying, in our day, but we know if we do the right thing, it will come eventually. But he says, don't think that you can continue on now pretending that you're not a Judean, because it'll come out. And even though you're the queen, if it comes out with Haman's way, you're not going to escape. You and your father's house will perish, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. What a beautiful sentiment. Why are we here at the time that we're here? What has God brought us here in his kingdom for? Say, we've got to be figuring those things out. So he's courageous. He has trust. In chapter 5, because he's encouraging Esther, she comes up with a plan. And her plan is going to take some doing, because it wasn't the queen's prerogative just to say, "Hey, husband, I want to talk to you," and especially in something of political matters. You know, the way it goes is the king calls for the queen, and she better come running when he calls. But she's got to take a risk based upon love. And yeah, the king's love for her, but more importantly, her love for her people. Her love for her fellow Judeans. So she takes this risk. She approaches the king and invites him and Haman to a feast the next day. And in verses 12 through 14 of chapter 5, moreover, Haman said, Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Oh, see, he feels so special. And his pride keeps puffing him up more and more. Yet all this avails me nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting by the king's gate and he doesn't bow down and pay me homage. He can't get over it. And he's not going to get over it. He's going to continue on. Verse 14, then his wife, this is Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. Go kill a man, and then go merrily into the king's banquet. You talk about evil, corrupt people that can do such terrible injustices to others and happily go on about their way. Now, doesn't that sound like some of the people in World War II as they were exterminating the Jews? Doesn't it sound like some of the things going on in the Middle East today when people are decapitated, when people are burned to death, and everybody's cheering, yay, way to go! Hatred and evil exist in this world. But now we begin to see the providence of God working in the lives of these people. First 10 verses of chapter 6. That night the king could not sleep, so one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. It was Mordecai who had told this plot against the king. See? Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. He's just been forgotten about. So the king said, who's in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai. Oh, you talk about irony. Look at that. That the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king says, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered as if this is something that's going to come to him. For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man with the king, whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, oh boy, Haman can't wait, right? Hurry, take the robe and the horse, do as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gates. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. You talk about deflation, depression. I've got to honor Mordecai. Mordecai's the one, not me. Mordecai. Oh, how terrible that must have been. So here's Mordecai. Working to do good, working to do right. He's hardly ever honored. Here's this evil Haman. He's honored all the time in the king's presence, but he thinks he deserves more and more. So he enters the banquet hall later, the banquet where the queen is putting on this banquet, fearing what would happen to him. And Queen Esther pleads the cause for people before the king and reveals that Haman is behind the insidious plot. That's verses 5 through 10 in chapter 7. So it's finally revealed, and very seldom do circumstances such as this work out for the best in this life. But listen, God was on the side of righteousness, not on the side of injustice. The justice was going to be served in this. God was providentially going to take care of, just simply think of Mordecai, a man who lived out the religion that he said he believed, that he trusted in, served the God he trusted in, was courageous enough to stand up and say no when the circumstances meant no. See? The providence of God was working in his life. So he's a man of uncommon faith. But what happens to him? First 6 verses of chapter 8, he's promoted to second in the kingdom. He deserved it. He was a wise man who would serve the king wisely. He would look out for the king's benefit and in the process help his people. Haman was looking out for Haman. That's where he failed. Through the king's command, though the king's command to kill the Jews could not be rescinded. And you can go and you look and you study this out. That's just the way it was. The king made a command, it had to be carried out. The king couldn't say, oh, I had my fingers crossed, no, we're not going to do that. No, that had to go through. But it didn't mean he couldn't make another command. So he issued another command that on that day, when the Jews would be exterminated, it was all right for them to use self-defense against those people. It's all right to use self-defense against evil people who are trying to destroy you. So Through that, the Jews slaughtered a lot of the people who were coming to kill them, to slaughter them. And in Esther 8, verses 15 through 17, let me look here. So Mordecai went out in the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. Oh, hey, that's what God promises us if we'll live for Him. If we will keep His will, that's what He promises for us. Light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then listen to this, then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Listen, it wasn't because of the slaughter that there was fear of the Jews. The fear of the Jews was they understood, these people understood that there was a God in heaven who was blessing this people and providentially caring for them. And they wanted in on it. They want to know what a great open door that led to. When God's people do God's will, they do it the right way, people flock to them to learn about the God of heaven. It's when we don't do it right that we tear things apart. Now, the last two chapters of Esther tell us of the greatness of the faith of Mordecai and Esther. In chapter 9, it tells the institution of the Feast of Purim, which was observed by the children of Israel until the time of Christ, and you will still find it on the calendar. Feast of Purim. We don't know what it's about. It's just there, you know. Well, they know what it's about. It's about the story of Esther and Mordecai. But in the 10th chapter, this speaks of the greatness Mordecai achieved because of his faith in God. Which is probably a story of Mordecai. What a great man. What a great inspiration he is. Well, the lesson is yours. Thank you for your time, and thank you so very much for your attention. So if you have need, we'll stand and sing the invitation song. Let your request be made known.